What's up, everybody? I'm Chris Curls, and this is the Highest Underground Show. Once again, we're back, and I'm reading The Iron Curtain Over America. We are on chapter 8, and it's a novel written in the 1950s by John Beatty, and I've been doing the audio book version with commentary now, and we're almost finished with it. So if you've listened to this after I read the next chapter, you'll have one awesome book put away under your belt, which is really good. All right, getting into it. Chapter 8 is called Cleaning the Augean Stables. It's kind of funny. It's a reference to Greek mythology and Hercules, but let's see. I'm sure he'll explain it. All right, here we go. In ancient fable, one of the giant labors of Hercules was cleaning the labyrinthine stables of King Augeas, who possessed an immense wealth of herds and 12 sacred bulls. The removal of accumulated filth was accomplished in the specified time, and the story of difficulty successfully overcome has been told through the ages for entertainment and for inspiration. Now, what I remember, I thought it was basically this king had stables. It was 3,000 oxen, and it hasn't been cleaned for 30 years. So Hercules diverted the river, Alpheus, I think, to come through the stables and clean it, and that's how he did it. But anyway, so getting back to the book. The modern significance of the parable of Hercules may be thus interpreted. King Augeas is Mr. Truman. The sacred bulls are those high and mighty individuals who control and deliver the votes of minority blocs. The filth is the 19-year accumulation of communists and fellow travelers in the various departments, executive agencies, bureaus, and whatnot of our government. I mean, just imagine, this is only 19 years he's saying it's been, and this is the 1950s. So in the 1920s, the late 20s, early 30s, this stuff's been going on, if not sooner. But that's crazy. I mean, I just imagine now how they've had 70 years, or I guess 90 years, almost 100 years that they've been working on subverting our country. To clean out the filth, there can be but one Hercules, an aroused American people. Exactly how can the American people proceed under our laws to clean out subversives and other scoundrels from our government? There are three principal ways. A, by a national election. B, by the constitutional right of expressing their opinion. And C, by influencing the Congress to exercise certain power vested in the Congress by the Constitution, including the power of impeachment, which is kind of silly thinking the whole impeachment process that they're trying to do against Trump right now. All right, so he goes on to describe a little bit. A, the national election. A national election is the normal means employed by the people to express their will for a change of policy. There are reasons, however, why such a means should not be exclusively relied on. For one thing, a man elected by the people may lose completely the confidence of the people and do irreparable damage by bad appointed personnel and bad policies after one election and before another. In the second place, our two leading parties consist of so many antagonistic groups wearing a common label that candidates for president and vice president represent compromises, and it is hard to get a clear-cut choice as between Democrats and Republicans. For instance, in the campaign of 1940, 1944, and 1948, the Republicans offered the American voters Wendell Willkie and Thomas Dewey, twice! Exclamation point. Willkie was a sincere but poorly informed and obviously inexperienced one-worlder, apparently with a soft spot toward communism, or at least a blind spot, as evidenced in his hiring or lending himself as a lawyer to prevent government action against alleged communists. Thus, among the 12 Communist Party leaders arrested on July 26, 1951 was William Schneiderman, state chairman of the Communist Party of California and a member of the alternate National Committee of the Communist Party of the United States. The preceding quotations are from the New York Times, and the article continues, quote, with the late Wendell L. Willkie as his counsel, Schneiderman defeated in the Supreme Court in 1943 a government attempt to revoke his citizenship for his political associations. Schneiderman was born in Russia, end of quote. Likewise, Governor Dewey of New York, campaigning on a Don't Bother the Communists program, won the Oregon Republican presidential primary election in 1948 in a close contest from Harold Stassen, who endorsed anti-communist legislation. Governor Dewey, largely avoiding issues except in this instance, moved on to nomination and to defeat The morale seems to be that the American people see no reason to change from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party with the candidate favorable to or indifferent to communism. With such a Republican candidate, a Democratic candidate may be favored by some conservatives who rely on the more or less conservative Democrats who extend from Maryland in an arc through the South around to Nevada to block the extreme radicalism of a Democratic administration. Governor Dewey followed the Roosevelt path not only in a disinclination to combat communism in such matters as the purge of Senator Rivercombe of West Virginia, he showed evidence of a dictatorial intention of which not even Roosevelt would have presumed. Thus, however much one may hope for a pair of strong, patriotic, and able Democratic candidates or a pair of strong, patriotic, and able Republican candidates at the next election, there is no certainty of a realized hope. And that's crazy that he's saying that back then, that there's not a good Republican or a Democrat. You're basically, fighting two wings of the same problem, and it's just gotten so much worse now. If he were alive to see this now, he would, I don't know, he'd probably take a gun and go storm the Capitol with people, right? All right. This statement is not meant to disparage the movement. Let me see here. Hold on, let me get back. There is likewise no certainty of success in the move of a number of patriotic people in both parties to effect a merger of American-minded Republicans and non-leftist Democrats in time for a slate of coalition candidates in the next presidential election. This statement is not meant to disparage the movement, whose principal sponsor, Senator Carl Munt, represents a state, South Dakota, not in the Union during the Civil War, and is therefore an ideal leader of a united party of patriotic Americans, both Northern and Southern. Senator Munt's proposal deserves active and determined support because it is logical for people who feel the same way to vote together. Moreover, the effective implementation of the Munt proposal would certainly be acclaimed by the great body of the people, those who acclaimed General MacArthur on his return from Tokyo. The stumbling block, of course, is that it is very hard for the great body of the people to make itself politically effective, either in policy or in the selection of delegates to the national nominating conventions, since leaders already in office will, with few exceptions, be reluctant to change the setup, whatever its evil, under which they became leaders. To sum up, a coalition team, as Senator Munt proposes, would be admirable. Nevertheless, other methods of effecting a change of our national policy must be explored. B. A possible way for the American public to gain its patriotic ends is by the Constitution-protected right of petition, the First Amendment. The petition, whether in the form of a document with many signatures or a mere individual letter, is far more effective than the average individual is likely to believe. In all cases, the letters received are beyond question tabulated as straws in the wind of public opinion, and to a busy congressman or senator, a carefully prepared and well-documented letter from a person he can trust may well be a guide to policy. The author thus summed up the influence of letters in his book, Image of Life. Let me see. I guess this is his own book, Image of Life. Quote, "It is perhaps unfortunate but undeniably true that letter writers wield a powerful influence in America. Along with the constant newspaper and magazine polls of citizens and voters, letters are the modern politician's method of keeping his ear to the ground. This fact was startlingly illustrated in 1939 by a high executive's issuing a statement justifying a certain governmental stand by an analysis of the correspondence received on the subject. Since the letter wields this influence, and since it is one of the chief weapons of the organized minority, public-spirited citizens should use it too. They should write to members of state legislatures, United States congressmen and senators, and other government officials endorsing or urging measures which the writers believe necessary for the good of the country. Similar letters of support should, of course, be written to any others in or out of government service who are under the fire of minorities for courageous work on behalf of decency, morality, and patriotism." End of quote. The use of the letter for political purposes by organized groups is illustrated by the fact that a certain congressman received in one day more than 5,000 letters and other forms of communication urging him to vote for a pending measure favorable to Israel, and not one postcard on the other side. Letters in great volume cannot be other than effective. To any congressman, even though he disapproves of the policy or measure endorsed by the letters, they raise the question of his being possibly in error in view of such overwhelming opposition to his viewpoint. To a congressman who believes sincerely, as some do, that he is an agent whose duty is not to act on his own judgment, but to carry out the people's will, a barrage of letters is a mandate on how to vote. Apparently, for the first time, those favoring Western Christian civilization adopted the technique of the opposition and expressed themselves in letters to Washington on the dismissal of General MacArthur. In addition to writing letters to the president and his staff and to one's own senators and congressmen, the patriotic American should write letters to other senators and congressmen who are members of committees concerned with a specific issue. In this way, he will meet and possibly frustrate the new tactics of the anti-American element, which, from its newspaper advertisements, seems to be shifting its controlled letters from a writer's own congressmen and senators to committee chairmen and committee members. For the greater effectiveness which comes from a knowledge of the structure of the government, the functions of its subdivisions, and the names of its officials, it is exceedingly important that each patriotic citizen possess or have access to a copy of the latest congressional directory. And it said it can be had in Washington for $1.50. I bet it's $25 these days. The patriotic citizen should not let his or her letter writing stop with letters to officials in Washington. Letters along constructive lines should be sent to other influential persons such as teachers, columnists, broadcasters, and judges, letting them know the writer's views. Persons such as Judge Medina, who presided in a fair and impartial manner over a trial involving charges of communism, are inundated by letters and telegrams of calumny and vilification. His words to the author at a meeting of the Columbia alumni in Dallas. To such officials, a few letters on the other side are heartening. Letters to newspapers are especially valuable. Whether published or not, they serve as opinion indicators to a publisher. Those that are published are sometimes clipped and mailed to the White House and to members of the Congress by persons who feel unable to compose letters of their own. The brevity of these letters and the voice of the people flavor cause them to be read by and thus to influence many who will not cope with the more elaborate expressions of opinion by columnists and editorial writers. All right, C. He says, a little backdrop here, as the 9th printing of the Iron Curtain over America was being prepared in the summer of 1952 for the press, it became a fact of history that President Truman would not succeed himself for the presidential term 1953 to 1957. The following pages of this chapter should therefore be read not as a specific recommendation directed against Mr. Truman, but as a general consideration of the question of influencing executive action through pressure upon congressional committees and, in extreme cases, by impeachment, with the acts and policies of Mr. Truman and his chief officials used as illustrative material. And it's funny how they want to blame Trump and impeach him when we've had some presidents who are really doing some fucked up shit against the country and against the will of the average American working class person, and they got away with it and they go down as these great presidents in history. All right. So, if the pressure of public opinion by a letter barrage or otherwise is of no avail because of already existing deep commitments as a payoff for blocks of votes or for other reasons, there are other procedures. The best of these, is indicated under B above, is to work through the appropriate committees of Congress. Unfortunately, the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Senate has a majority of members willing to play along with almost any vote-getting scheme. It was only by the skillful maneuvering of the chairman, Senator Tom Connally of Texas, that the committee was prevented from passing during World War II a pro-Zionist resolution on the Middle East, which might have prejudiced the American victory in the war. Despite Mr. Atchison's record, every Republican on the committee approved the nomination of that career man to be Secretary of State. Thus, with no Republican opposition to attract possible votes from the Democratic majority, the committee vote on Atchison's confirmation was unanimous. Parenthetically, a lesson is obvious, namely that both political parties should in the future be much more careful than in the past in according committee membership to a senator or to a representative of doubtful suitability for the committee for sharing the committee's responsibilities. Despite one very unfortunate selection, the Republican membership of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs averages up better than the Republican membership of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. The House Committee is not so influential, however, because of the Constitution's express vesting of foreign policy in the Senate. In contrast, however, The House Appropriations Committee is, under the Constitution, more influential than the Appropriations Committee in the Senate, and might, under public pressure, withhold funds from a government venture, office, or individual believed inimical to the welfare of the United States. In the matter of appropriations, the Senate Committee on Appropriations has, however, made a great record in safeguarding what it believes to be the public interest. For example, in 1946, the senior Republican member of this vital Senate committee was instrumental in achieving the congressional elimination from the State Department budget of $4 million earmarked for the Alfred McCormick Unit, an accomplishment which forced the exit of that undesired special assistant to the Secretary of State. There is no reason why this thoroughly constitutional procedure should not be imitated in the 1950s. The issue was raised for discussion by Congressman John Phillips of California, a member of the House Appropriations Committee, in May 1951. In mid-1950, the House Committee on Un-American Activities seemed to need prodding by letters from persons in favor of the survival of America. The situation was described thus in a Washington Times Herald entitled "Watch the Watchman," and I quote, "The reason the committee has gone to sleep is that it is now, also for the first time in its history, subservient to the executive departments which have so long hid the communists and fought the committee. For evidence, compare the volume entitled Hearings Regarding Communism in the United States Government, Part 2, that record committee proceedings of August 28th and 31st and September 1st and 15th in 1950, with the records of comparable inquiries any year from the committee's origin in 1938 down to 1940, when the present membership took over. The witnesses who appeared before the committee in the latest hearings need no explaining. They were Lee Pressman, Abraham George Silverman, Nathan Witt, Charles Kramer, John J. Abt, and Max Lowenthal." Now, all of those names sound very, very peculiar, don't they? This handsome galaxy represents the very distilled essence of inside knowledge on matters that can help the people of this republic understand why we are now wondering where Stalin is going to hit us next. At least one, Max Lowenthal, is an intimate friend of President Truman, regularly in and out of side interests at the White House. Perhaps that accounts, of course it does, for the arrogant assurance with which Lowenthal spit in the committee's eye when he was finally brought before it for a few feeble questions. End of quote. Incidentally, Truman was chosen as a candidate for vice president by Sidney Hillman at the suggestion of Max Lowenthal. In fairness to the present membership, however, it is well to add that from a variety of circumstances, the committee has suffered from a remarkable and continuing turnover of membership since the convening of the 81st Congress in January 1949. New regulations passed for the purpose of the Democratic 81st Congress, which was elected along with President Trump in 1948, drove from the committee two of its most experienced and aggressive members, Mr. Rankin of Mississippi, because he was chairman of the Committee on Veterans Affairs, and Mr. Habert of Louisiana, because he was not a lawyer. In January 1949, the experienced Congressman Carl Munt of South Dakota left the House and his membership on the committee to take his seat in the Senate. Promotion to the Senate likewise cost the committee the services of Congressman Richard Nixon of California, the member most active in the preliminaries to the trial of Algiers Hiss. In the election of 1950, Representative Francis Case of South Dakota was advanced to the Senate. After a single term on the committee, Congressman Burr P. Harrison of Virginia became a member of the Ways and Means Committee, an appointment which excluded him from the Committee on Un-American Activities. Thus, when the committee was reconstituted at the opening of the 82nd Congress in January 1951, only one man, Chairman John S. Wood of Georgia, had more than one full 2-year term of service, and a majority of the 9 members were new. Excuse me. The committee, like all others, needs letters of encouragement to offset pressure from pro-communist elements, but there were evidences in 1951 of its revitalization. On April 1st, 1951, it issued a report entitled "The Communist Peace Offensive," which it described as the most dangerous hoax ever devised by the international communist conspiracy. Moreover, in 1951, the committee was again probing the important question of communism in the motion picture industries at Hollywood, California. Finally, late in 1951, the Un-American Activities Committee issued a brand new publication called A Guidebook to Subversive Organizations, highly recommended by the Americanism Legion, and copies may be had for 25 cents. Okay, I guess there was a book to all these subversive organizations, and I think this book lists them as well in the back of all. I think I may have read one in one chapter, I can't remember, but there was a lot, y'all, and they all sound like, the Americans for Jewish interest, or Americans for workers' rights, and it sounds like something that, oh yeah, that's a pro-American, but they're really communist organizations. And of course, in the motion picture industries at Hollywood, California, are going to be communist leaning because they're controlled by Jews. Fortunately, the Senate Judiciary Committee is also accomplishing valuable work in the exposure of the nature and methods of the communist infiltration. Its work is referred to. Its chairman, Senator McCarran of Nevada, is quoted, and its documents are represented by excerpts here and there in this book. The Rules Committee of the House was restored to its traditional power by the 82nd Congress in 1951, and may also prove an effective brake on bills for implementing the dangerous policies of an incompetent, poorly advised, or treasonable leadership in the executive departments. As a last resort, however, a president of the United States or any other member of the executive or judicial branches of the government can be removed by impeachment. Article 1, Section 2, Paragraph 5, Article 1, Section 3, Paragraph 6, Article 2, Section 1, Paragraph 6, and Article 2, Section 4, Paragraph 1 of the U.S. Constitution name the circumstances under which and provide explicitly the means by which a majority of the representatives and 2/3 of the senators can remove a president who is guilty of misdemeanors or shows inability to perform the high functions of his office. Surely some such construction might have been placed upon Mr. Truman's gross verbal attack upon the United States Marine Corps, whose members were at the time dying in Korea, or upon his repeated refusal to cooperate with Canada, with Congress, or with the courts in facing up to the menace of the 43,217 known communists said by J. Edgar Hoover to be operating in this country, with 10 times that many following the communist line in anti-American propaganda, and all of them ready for sabotage in vital areas if the Soviet Union should give the word. Wow, this was in the Dallas Times Herald, and I guess J. Edgar Hoover called out the communists, and I wonder how long he was doing this before they got to him and started blackmailing him. All right, getting back. The matter of President Truman's unwillingness to move against communism came to a head with the passage of the Internal Security Act of 1950. Under the title Necessity for Legislation, the two houses of Congress found as follows, and I quote, "There exists a world communist movement which in its origins, its development, and its present practice is a worldwide revolutionary movement whose purpose it is, by treachery, deceit, infiltration into other groups, governmental and otherwise, espionage, sabotage, terrorism, and any other means deemed necessary, to establish a communist totalitarian dictatorship in the countries throughout the world through the medium of a worldwide communist organization. The communist network in the United States is inspired and controlled in large part by foreign agents who are sent into the United States ostensibly as attaches of foreign legations, affiliates of international organizations, members of trading commissions, and in similar capacities, but who use their diplomatic or semi-diplomatic status as a shield behind which to engage in activities prejudicial to the public security. There are, under our present immigration laws, numerous aliens who have been found to be deportable, many of whom are in the subversive, criminal, or immoral classes who are free to roam the country at will without supervision or control. The communist organizations in the United States, pursuing its stated objectives, the recent successes of communist methods in other countries, and the nature and control of the world communist movement itself, present a clear and present danger to the security of the United States and to the existence of free American institutions, and make it necessary that Congress, in order to provide for the common defense, to preserve the sovereignty of the United States as an independent nation, and to guarantee to each state a republican form of government, enact appropriate legislation recognizing the existence of such worldwide conspiracy and designed to prevent it from accomplishing its purposes in the United States." End of quote. A measure for curbing communism in the United States, prepared in light of the above preamble, was approved by both Senate and the House. It was then sent to the President. What did he do? He vetoed it. Thereupon, both Senate and House overrode the president's veto by far more than the necessary two-thirds majorities, and the Internal Security Act became Public Law 831 in the 81st Congress, second session. The enforcement of the law, of course, became the responsibility of its implacable enemy, the head of the executive branch of our government. But the president's efforts to block the anti-communists did not end with that historic veto. Quote, President Truman Thursday rejected a Senate committee's request for complete files on the State Department's loyalty security cases on the grounds that it would be clearly contrary to the public interest. End of quote. That was in an AP dispatch. To what public did Mr. Truman refer? The situation was summed up well by General MacArthur in a speech before a joint session of the Mississippi legislature. The general stated that our policy is leading us toward a communist state with as dreadful certainty as those of the leaders of the Kremlin themselves were charting our course. In view of his veto of the International Security Act and his concealment of security data on government employees from congressional committees, it is hard to exonerate Mr. Truman from the suspicion of having more concern for leftist votes than for the safety or survival of the United States. Or he was just getting paid off by communists and other Eastern European Jews. That could have been, he's getting paid off, so that's why he's vetoing these things. All right, getting back. Such facts naturally suggest an inquiry into the feasibility of initiating the process of impeachment. Another possible ground for impeachment might be the president's apparent violation of the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Paragraph 11, which vests in Congress the power to declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, and make rules concerning captures on land and water. This authority of the Congress has never been effectively questioned. Thus, in his political observations in 1795, James Madison wrote, "The Constitution expressively and exclusively vests in the legislature the power of declaring a state of war." Let me see here. All right, end of quote. Subsequent interpreters of our basic state paper, except perhaps some of those following in the footsteps of Supreme Court Justice Brandeis, have concurred. It was seemingly in an effort to avoid the charge of violating this provision of the Constitution that President Truman, except for a reported occasional slip of the tongue, chose to refer to his commitment of our troops in Korea as a police state action and not a war. This is where they try to get tricky with words, and the Talmudic tricks that he's been taught by Jewish lawyers. Oh, it's not a war, it's a police action. Yeah, well, I don't think the people dying and the troops and the military know that. I think they think it's a war. And for them, it is a war. All right. Referring to the possibility of President Truman sending 4 additional divisions to Europe where there was no war, Senator Byrd of Virginia said, "But if by chance he does ignore Congress, Congress has ample room to exercise its authority by the appropriations methods, and it would be almost grounds for impeachment." The distinguished editor and commentator David Lawrence also brought up the question of impeachment. He says, quote, "If we are to grow technical, Congress too has some constitutional rights. If we can impeach President Truman not only for carrying out a war in Korea without a declaration of war by Congress, but primarily for failing to let our troops fight the enemy with all the weapons at their command," end of quote. And he was saying how obviously he knows some information that if our troops would know, and we were supplying weapons to communists that were then fighting our troops, and it was the hypocrisy of it is astounding. All right, that was the end of quote. All right, the question of President Truman's violation of the Constitution in the matter of committing our troops in Korea has been raised with overwhelming logic by Senator Carl Mundt of South Dakota. Article 43 of the United Nations Charter, as the senator points out, provides that member nations of the UN shall supply armed forces in accordance with their respective constitutional processes. Thus, the starting of the Truman-Atchison War in Korea not only violated the United States Constitution, but completely lacked United Nations authority until such authority was voted retroactively. That's crazy. I mean, it's amazing that things that, I don't know how these people let this happen. I guess it's just like we're letting shit happen now with, all these people in Congress who are basically throwing our country under the bus, and we're allowing it to happen. And what do? They were letting it happen then. I mean, it's obviously the fluoride in the water, right? And I'm not sure when fluoride got put in the water. I have to go back, but I remember it was the aluminum company paid a congressman $200,000, maybe it was $200,000 to come up with this bill that allowed, based on some faulty studies, that allowed the aluminum company to get away by putting sodium fluoride, tiny bits, into the drinking water of the people, and they, under the guise of it was good for your teeth. It's not. All right. Getting back to the book. The House in the 81st Congress several times overrode a Truman veto by more than the constitutional 2/3 vote. Even in that 81st Congress, more than 5/6 of the senators voted to override the president's veto of the McCarran-Munt-Nixon anti-communist bill, which became Public Law 831. With the retirement of Mrs. Helen Douglas and other noted administration supporters, and Mr. Vito Marcantonio, the 82nd Congress is probably even less inclined than the predecessor Congress to tolerate the Truman attitude toward the control of subversives, and might not hesitate in a moment of grave national peril to certify to the Senate for possible impeachment for a violation of the Constitution the name of a man so dependent on leftist votes, or so sympathetic with alien thought that he sees no menace, merely a red herring in communism. Wow, that guy wrote a very long sentence then. He should have broken up. With the defeat of such left of center men, to use a term which President Franklin Roosevelt applied to himself, as Claude Pepper, Frank Graham, and Glenn Taylor, and such administration henchmen as Millard Tydings, Scott Lucas, and Francis Myers, with election from the House of new members such as Everett Dirksen, Richard Nixon, and Francis Case, and with other new members such as Wallace F. Bennett, John M. Butler, and Herman Welker. The Senate also might not hesitate in a moment of grave national peril to take appropriate steps toward impeachment under the Constitution. Incidentally, a rereading of the Constitution of the United States is particularly valuable to anyone who is in doubt as to the relative importance of the Congress, the President, and the Supreme Court under the basic law of the land. Whereas the Congress is granted specific authority to remove for cause the President and any other executive or justice of the Supreme Court, neither the President nor the Supreme Court has any authority whatsoever of the qualifications or tenure of office of a senator or a representative. Good books on the Constitution, both by Thomas James Norton, or The Constitution of the United States, its sources and its applications. This was written in 1940. I would love to get this book. I'm going to have to highlight it right here, because I bet this was before the Jewish lawyers started subverting the Constitution with the Talmudic, word trickery and doublespeak. Anyway, in another valuable book, The Key to Peace, the author, Dean Clarence Mannion of Notre Dame Law School, develops the idea that the key to peace is the protection of the individual under our Constitution. With reference again to impeachment, and examination of the career of other high executives, including the Secretary of State, might possibly find one or more of them who might require investigation on the suspicion of unconstitutional misdemeanors. Despite the bitter fruit of Yalta, Mr. Atchison never issued a recantation. He never repudiated his affirmation of lasting fidelity to his beloved friend, Alger Hiss, who was at Yalta as the newly appointed State Department Director of Special Political Affairs. Despite the Chinese attack on our troops in Korea, Mr. Atchison never, to the author's knowing, admitted the error, if not the treason, of the policy of his department's Bureau of Far Eastern Affairs down to and including the year of 1950, when these Chinese communists, the darlings of the dominant leftists of our State Department, attacked us in the moment of our victory over the communists of North Korea. Quote, "What then will you do with the fact that as concerning Soviet Russia, from Yalta to this day, every blunder in American foreign policy has turned out to be what the Kremlin might have wished this country to do? All you can say is that if there had been a sinister design, it would look like this." End of quote. This was written in the Freeman in June 18th, 1951. And I told y'all I'm going to have to check on that paper, the Freeman, because they were based. They were talking about some really cool stuff and calling people out back then. General Marshall was at Yalta as Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army. According to press reports, he never remembered what he was doing the night before Pearl Harbor. At Yalta, it was not memory but judgment that failed him, for he was the superior officer who tacitly, if not heartily, approved the military deals along the Elbe and the Yalu, deals which are still threatening to ruin our country. General Ambassador Marshall not only failed miserably in China, Secretary of State Marshall took no effective steps when a Senate Appropriations Subcommittee, according to Senator Ferguson of Michigan, handed him a memorandum stating in part, quote, "It becomes necessary due to the gravity of the situation to call your attention to a condition that developed and still flourishes in the State Department under the administration of Dean Acheson. It is evident that there is a deliberate, calculated program being carried out not only to protect communist personnel in high places, but to reduce security and intelligence protection to a nullity." End of quote. This was in the Washington Times-Herald. The reference to Acheson was to Undersecretary Acheson, as he then was. Unfortunately, in late 1951, when General Marshall ceased to be Secretary of Defense, he was replaced by another man, Robert H. Leavitt, who, whatever his personal views, carried nevertheless the stigma of having been Undersecretary of State from July 1947 to January 1949, when our position in China was being ruined under the then Secretary of State George C. Marshall. The pro-Soviet accomplishments of the high-placed leftists and their dupes in our government are brilliantly summed up by Edna Lonigan in Human Events, September 8, 1948. And I quote, "Our victorious armies halted where Stalin wished. His followers managed Dumbarton Oaks, UN, UNRRA, our Polish and Spanish policies. They gave Manchuria and Northern Korea to communism. They demoted General Patton and wrote infamous instruction under which General Marshall was sent to China. They dismantled German industry, ran the Nuremberg trials, and even sought to dictate our economic policy in Japan. Their greatest victory was the Morgenthau Plan." Ooh, I wonder who he's talking about, they. All right, and end of quote. And the astounding thing is that except for the dead Roosevelt, Hillman, Hopkins, Wynant, and Mr. Morgenthau, and Mr. Hiss, and General Marshall, most of those chiefly responsible for our policy as described above were still in power in June of 1952. That's his exclamation point on that. So these people who are fucking us over were still in power, and people who are passing legislation or making decisions that were helping communists and hurting Americans. In solemn truth, do not 7 persons share most of the responsibility for the establishing the communist grip on the world? Are not the 7 Marx, the founder of violent communism; Engels, the promoter of Marx; Trotsky, Lenin, and Stalin; Franklin D. Roosevelt, who rescued the tottering communist empire by recognition in 1933, by the resultant financial support by his refusal to proceed against communists in the United States, and by the provisions of the Yalta Conference. And 7 is Harry S. Truman, who agreed at Potsdam to the destruction of Germany and thereafter followed the Franklin Roosevelt policy of refusing to act against communists in the United States, the one strong nation which remains as a possible obstacle to communist world power. And I guess we're not anymore, because they've taken over our country. I mean, the communist New World Order is coming, folks. It's coming, and you better get ready, because it's going to be bloody. It always is. They've done this before. It's not a new thing. In spite of the consolidation of Stalin's position in Russia by Franklin Roosevelt and by Stalin's liquidation of millions of anti-communists in Russia after Roosevelt's recognition, the Soviet Union in 1937 was stymied in its announcement program of world conquest by 2 roadblocks: Japan in the east and Germany in the west. These countries, the former the size of California and the latter the size of Texas. Let me see here. Wow, Japan's the size of California and Germany's about the size of Texas. Okay. Were small for great powers, and since their main fears were of the enormous hostile and nearby Soviet Union, they did not constitute an actual danger to the United States. The men around Roosevelt, many of them later around Truman, not merely defeated but destroyed the 2 roadblocks against the spread of Stalinist communism. Again, we come to the question, should the United States continue to use the men whose stupidity or treason built the Soviet Union into one great land power of the world? Wow. That's crazy to think about it like that. I mean, that's when Japan and Germany were the 2 bulwarks that were to stop the spread of communists in the East and the West. And during World War II, both of them were completely destroyed and dismantled and taken over by the United States, who was obviously taken over by communist interests. In continuing to employ people who were in office during the tragic decisions of Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam, are we not exactly as sensible as a hypothetical couple who employ the same babysitter who has already killed 3 of their children? By what fate, then, can we find hope in those who want past judgment so grievously erred as Senator Augean of Montana on September 7th, 1951? Can we trust the future to those who betrayed the past, as Senator Jenner of Indiana in a speech in the Senate of the United States on September 19th, 1950? Whatever the cause of our State Department's performances, so tragic for America in 1945 and thereafter, the answer to Senator Jenner's point-blank question is an incontrovertible no, which was, can we trust the future to those who betrayed the past? No, we cannot. Congressman, the patriotic elements in the press and the letter-writing public should continually warn the President, however, that a mere shuffling around of the same old cast of Yalta actors and others whose past judgments so grievously erred will not be sufficient. We must not again have tolerators of extreme leftism such as Mr. John J. McCloy, who was Assistant Secretary of War from April 1941 to November of 1945, and Major General Clayton Bissell, who was AC he was he was the Army's Chief of Intelligence from February 5th, 1944 to the end of the war. In February 1945, these high officials were questioned by a 5-man committee created by the new 79th Congress to investigate charges of communism in the War Department. In the New York Times of February 28th, an article by Lewis Wood, Mr. McCloy is quoted as follows, quote, "The facts point to the difficulties of legal theory which are involved in taking the position that mere membership in the Communist Party, present or past, should exclude a person from the Army or a commission. But beyond any question of legal theory, a study of the question and our experience convinced me that we were not on sound ground in our investigation when we placed emphasis solely on communist affiliation." End of quote. According to some newspapers, Mr. McCloy's testimony gave the impression that he did not care if 49% of a man's loyalty was elsewhere, provided he was 51% American. The validity of Christ's "no man can serve 2 masters" was widely recalled to mind. Edward N. Schieberling, National Commander of the American Legion, referring to Assistant Secretary of War McCloy's testimony, stated, quote, that the Assistant Secretary had testified that the new policy of the armed forces would admit to officer-ranked persons 49% loyal to an alien power and only 51% loyal to the United States. End of quote. The Legion head asserted further, why don't you just put it together? So open up the quote again. 51% loyalty is not enough when the security of our country is at stake. The lives of our sons, the vital military secrets of our armed forces must not be entrusted to men of divided loyalty. End of quote. The Washington Times-Herald took up the cudgels against Mr. McCloy when he was shifted to the World Bank and thence to the post of High Commissioner of Germany. With sufficient documentation to appear convincing, the Freeman, as late as August 27, 1951, stated that Mr. McCloy seems to be getting and accepting a kind of advice that borders on mental disorder. General Bissell was moved from the U.S. military attaché at London. He received a little later a bon voyage present of a laudatory feature article in the Communist Daily Worker. Below the accompanying portrait was the legend Major General Clayton Bissell, wartime head of the U.S. Army Intelligence Corps, who defended communist soldiers from the attacks of Washington seat warmers during the war. End of quote. What a craziness, huh? What of the Congressional Committee? Though it had been created in order to work by a coalition of patriotic Republicans and Southern Democrats, each party chose its own committee members. The Democratic majority in the House chose members to its left of center liking, and the committee, by a strict party vote of 3-2, expressed itself as satisfied with the testimony of McCloy and Bissell. Surely the American public wants no high officials tolerant of communists or thanked by communists for favors rendered. Surely Americans will not longer be fooled by another shuffling of the soiled New Deal deck with its red aces, deuces, knaves, and jokers. This time will we not be We will not be blinded by a spurious bipartisan appointment of Atchisonites whose nominal membership in the Republican Party does not conceal an ardent Me Tooism. Americans surely will not, for instance, tolerate actors like Tweedledum John Foster Dulles, who goes along with Tweedledee Atchison right down the line, even to such an act as inviting his to New York to become president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, of which Dulles was the new chairman of the board. It might have been expected that with Hissaway, his trouble in Washington would blow over, but it didn't. The reference to high-placed War Department officials whose loyalty or judgment has been questioned by some of their fellow Americans brings us to an evaluation of the reception given in all parts of the nation to General MacArthur after his dismissal by President Truman in April 1951. It seems that General MacArthur's ovation was not due to his 5 stars. For half a dozen generals and admirals have similar rank, but to his being a man of unquestioned integrity, unquestioned patriotism, and above all, to his being avowedly a Christian. Long before the spring crisis of 1951, General MacArthur was again and again featured in the obscure religious papers of many Christian denominations as a man who asked for more Christian missionaries for Japan and for New Testaments to give his soldiers. MacArthur's devout Christianity was jeered in some quarters, but it made a lasting impression on that silent majority of Americans who have been deeply wounded by the venality and treason of men in high places. I was privileged in Tokyo, wrote John Gunther in The Riddle of MacArthur, to read through the whole file of MacArthur's communications and pronouncements since the occupation began, and many of these touch, at least indirectly, on religious themes. He constantly associates Christianity with both democracy and patriotism. MacArthur is a Protestant, but to the editor of the Brooklyn Tablet, a Catholic periodical, he wrote as follows, quote, "Through daily contact with our American men and women who are here engaged in the reshaping of Japan's future, they are penetrating into the Japanese mind the noble influences which find their origin and their inspiration in the American home. These influences are rapidly bearing fruit, and apart from the great numbers who are coming formally to embrace the Christian faith, a whole population is coming to understand, practice, and cherish its underlying principles and ideals." End of quote. To some people, this language of General MacArthur's may seem outmoded or antiquarian. The writing of the more publicized American theologians, darlings of the leftist book reviews, may indicate that the clear water of classical Christianity is drying up in a desert of experimental sociology, psychiatry, and institutionalized ethical culture. But such is not the case. The heart of America is still Christian in its felt need of redemption and salvation, as well as in its fervent belief in the resurrection. Christianity, in the historical or classical sense, is closely allied with the founding and growth of America. It was the common adherence to some form of Christianity which made it possible to develop some degree of national unity out of the heterogeneous nationalities represented among the colonists of early America. And what he's saying, that Christianity is the one thing that bind all of the communists, whether they Catholic, Protestant, Puritan, whatever it was, the Lutherans, it didn't matter, because Christianity held them together. This acceptance of the tenets of Christianity as the basis of our American society gave our people a body of shared ideals, a universally accepted code of conduct. Firmly rooted in Christianity was our conception of honor, both personal and national. It was not until a dominant number of powerful preachers and church executives got tired of the church's foundation stone, charity, and abandoned it to welfare agencies. It was not until these same leaders transferred their loyalty from the risen Christ to a new sort of leftist cult stemming from the national councils and conferences that public morality declined to its present state in America. But the people in the leftist infiltrated churches have by no means strayed, as far as their leaders, from the mainstream of Christianity. And let me reread this. It says, "It was not until a dominant number of powerful preachers and church executives got tired of the church's foundation stone, which was charity, and abandoned it to welfare agencies," because I don't believe in the welfare system. I believe in charity. And people talk about, oh, we need the welfare system for people who can't work. Disabled people, old people, were always taken care of by the church and charitable donations, and they help. That's why you belong to something. That's why you go to church and you belong to a church, and the church will take care of you, or at least that's what it used to. Now that she's saying that the church gave up that responsibility to the welfare agencies of the government. All right. The really Christian people in all denominations wish to see restored in America the set of values, the pattern of conduct, the code of honor which constitute and unify Western civilization and which once made ours a great and united country. It was precisely to this starved sense of spiritual unity, this desire to recover a lost spiritual heritage, that MacArthur, the Christian, made an unconscious appeal which burst forth into an enthusiasm never before seen in our country. And so, when the Augean stables of our government are cleaned out, we must, in the words of George Washington, put only Americans on guard. We must have as secretaries of state and defense men who will go down through their list of assistant secretaries, counselors, division chiefs, and so on, and remove all persons under any suspicion of communism, whether by ideological expression, association, or whatnot. While danger stalks the world, we should entrust the destiny of our beloved country to those, and only those, who can say with no reservation, "This is my own, my native land." Y'all, that's the end of the chapter 8, cleaning the Augean stables. Chapter 9 is the last chapter, and that's going to be it. It is pretty long, so I might break it up. Let me see here. It starts on 230 and ends on 275. So it's 45 pages, which is pretty long, so I might break it up into 2 readings, an A and B. The chapter is called America Can Still Be Free. Now, I don't think we can say that anymore. I think America is on its way to collapsing. And it might be a good thing, collapsing. You can't just collapse a civilization and think that you're going to build another one completely from scratch. Our civilization was given to us by our ancestors and by the values and culture and traditions that they passed down to us. And it was based on Christianity, is what this book is saying. Western civilization is Western Christian civilization. And you can't just ignore all of those things that our ancestors gave to us. And we're not just going to be able to build a new America. If America is going to split, you're going to have Christians and religious people going one way, and the secularists and the communists and the atheists going another way. They can't coincide. So, y'all, thanks for listening. Sorry about the other day. I had somebody walking in, the dogs were barking at the end of the chapter, so I had to shut it off real fast. Nothing like that happened today, but I'll see y'all next time. Thanks for listening.